Welcome to everybody. Good day, good afternoon, good night for some of us. Today we are going to discuss with three authors, Alberto Andreotti, Patrick Galès, Javier Moreno-Fuentes, of one article. Actually, it's one book today, which is called Globalized Minds, Roots in the City, Urban Upper Middle Classes in Europe. 2014, published in 2014. And we're going to have 15 minutes of presentation of the book. And after our critics is going to give you some food for thoughts. Please, Patrick and Javier, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Javier is starting.
The way we decided to do this is basically that I am going to do the presentation, basically, so that to simplify the structure of this. And then after that, we will all answer to your questions and comments in the order that we consider more or less appropriate. We thought we would use some kind of Southern European improvisation, and hopefully it will work relatively well. So, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this initiative. It's a first for me to do this kind of online interaction, and I hope with technical challenges, but I'm sure we'll figure it out more or less. So, without further ado, I will start by saying a few things about the work we are presenting. I understand that you all have read several sections of the book, so you're well familiarized with the structure of the book and the different topics we cover in it. So I will not be thoroughly going through the entire structure of the book and the contents. I would just like to point at some of the main arguments that I think are relevant and key findings of our research. And after that, hopefully everything else that I didn't mention will come out in the discussion. So the first thing that I would like to say, and not as a disclaimer, but actually as basically putting the cards on top of the table, is that our research was from the very beginning, starting many years ago already, like 38 or 90 years ago even, was conceived as an explanatory research. In a way, we had a series of ideas, and we wanted to discuss a series of topics that some of which we thought were right, others we thought were exaggerated, others we thought were openly wrong. And we wanted to actually generate empirical evidence that would help us basically look at these processes that everybody was kind of talking about and continues talking about, globalization and the way European societies are changing and the role that different social groups are playing in those changes. And we wanted to address this by providing empirical evidence. So in order to do that, we designed this research, which of course had to be fine-tuned and changed over time, but ended up being a comparison of 3 countries, 4 cities within these 3 countries, 4 neighborhoods in each of those cities. So basically meaning 16 neighborhoods altogether in 3 different countries. So you can imagine that this had a lot of complexity. What we had in mind was basically conduct in-depth interviews with upper middle classes, and I will say a few more things about that later on, what we conceptualize as upper middle classes. And in these in-depth interviews, we wanted to collect both hard and quantitative data, but also qualitative narrative data that our informants would give us to try to understand what role these groups were actually playing in these processes of globalization and this kind of redefinition of scales of reference and of identity that we wanted to look at. So I wanted to say it was a very challenging empirical research, and we did our best, and we are quite satisfied with the results, but also well aware of some of the problems and limitations of the work, which hopefully will come out later again during your comments and questions. So as I said before, the main purpose of the research, so basically what appears on the presentation that Alberta has uploaded, the theoretical background, was basically a discussion about what role is actually cosmopolitanism really playing in the shape and form that Europeans today. And we were puzzled by this notion that globalization, kind of the global level of reference, was basically taking over all the other dimensions that we normally had thoroughly studied in social sciences, basically the national nation-state societies, and within that the more kind of close to social urban sociology dimension of cities and the territory to which people relate to. And bottom line or concern was basically to try to understand which is the interaction of these three different levels of reference for this group that we talk about, which is basically the transnational, the national, and the local. And we wanted to look carefully at what effect this interaction of three levels was having on the traditional hierarchies of power that exist within European societies, to, in a way, see to what extent this globalization trend that obviously is happening comes to basically question completely all hierarchies and to create new ones, and basically also to discuss this general idea that we are witnessing the emergence of what we have heard as new barbarians, that basically would basically be this kind of floating elite that would have no anchorage in any society and would be freely floating around in the world, and this would be kind of the new masters of the universe somehow. And we wanted to see to what extent that this group is actually really that relevant, and whether these type of strategies are the ones that European elites are kind of aiming at today. And in fact, what we could say was one of our starting hypotheses was that this is actually probably not the case. I mean, we claim that in a way, the new, what is kind of emerging globalization, all that, is not really eroding the old, but in a way kind of complementing, transforming the old, but not to remove it completely, generating a new form of social structure and hierarchy, but basically transforming what had previously existed. So in this respect, the basic mechanism, the basic kind of strategy that we or upper middle classes would be implementing in to try to combine different levels of reference is basically what we have built, like one of the central tenets of our book, which is basically the notion of partial exit. So in a way, we basically claim that the upper middle classes in Europe are not exiting their national societies and are not exiting their local environments in which they grew up and live, but actually develop what we call partial exit strategies, which means that they design strategies in which they opt in and opt out in different levels and different dimensions of their national and local societies in order to try to maximize their chances to basically move up the social ladder and remain in control within their societies. So this element of partial exit is one of the central aspects that structures or book or work, and we put this in different axes, and the most clear one is basically the discussion, the relation between what we call, well, the dimension of mobility. So to what extent or upper middle classes or key group that we research basically develop mobility strategies, basically moving transnationally, but also nationally. To what extent they travel around, they spend time abroad, they see their lives as having to kind of be mobile in territory. But at the same time, to what extent this is in a dialogue with what we basically label as rootedness, the logic that these upper middle classes may have also very strong links to the territory and obviously to social groups that they normally relate to. Obviously, and firstly here, their families, but also their friends and relatives in a larger sense. So being partial exit, this kind of central element we wanted to look at, we refer to this partial exit both in the dimension of mobility, so basically to what extent their moving abroad is something that they conceive as permanent or longer period, or whether it was actually something that we also kind of consider one of our hypotheses, to what extent these upper middle classes are considering mobility as an additional asset that they can mobilize in order to later on capitalize and basically move up the social ladder within their own national society. So mobility used as a strategy to improve their position within their own societies. And the other element, which would be you on the other side of the coin, is the rootedness. So to what extent these upper middle classes that would be relatively mobile in the territory would also consider the need or the desire to actually be very well linked to the territory, sometimes the very same area, neighborhood, city where they grew up, other times areas that of their choosing, but what other elements they would consider into their into the process of selecting where to live. And here one of the conclusions that was quite obvious from the very beginning was that family continues to be a very central aspect in these development of these kind of strategies that or upper middle classes would develop. So in order to kind of test this general hypothesis and to look at these dynamics, we structure our questionnaire along a series of dimensions that we pose questions to our informants and try to collect information about. And from there, we basically develop our research and even structure the book, because it more or less follows that very same kind of line of argument. And the first thing we wanted to ask our upper middle classes was basically which were their professional trajectories. So to what extent they had included traveling abroad, living abroad, studying abroad, working abroad as part of their life careers in their minds and in practice as well. So we collected quite a lot of information about this and soon realized that most of our informants had spent significant amounts of time abroad, and they had quite often considered this as part of this strategy of moving up within their own national society. So it was very rarely an strategy, an open-ended strategy of living without knowing what was going to happen. Most of the time it was a strategy, a constant strategy of spending time abroad with the objective of cashing in when returning. So that was one of the first dimensions we studied. The second one was the residential trajectory, which, as you can imagine, is obviously related to this rootedness logic. And what we wanted to see was how our upper middle classes selected the areas where they live, and which main factors they were keeping in mind when deciding where they're going to live. And of course, there is plenty of variation here within the different cities and the different countries that we looked at. But basically, the hypothesis, the specific hypothesis for this topic that we developed was the logic of distance proximity, which is in a way a translation of the logic of partial exit into the territorial dimension. And the logic here being that our upper middle classes are actually interested in living in areas that in a way they relate to, areas in which they can see people more or less like themselves, but that doesn't transform these upper middle classes into segregators. We didn't see our informants as groups looking for secession from the rest of society. Yes, they in general feel more comfortable with surrounded by people like themselves, but that doesn't mean they are completely opposed to the idea of living side by side with other social groups, which may be of different social extraction or ethnicity, for example. So here is what we elaborated as the notion of distance proximity strategy for informants. And in a way, the conclusion about this particular dimension we studied was the argument that our upper middle classes are not heroes of mixity, so they are not absolutely, let's say, in living in multicultural neighborhoods in which they could live side by side with people much poorer than them, but at the same time, they were not obsessed with the idea of living in gated communities separated from the rest of society and only surrounded by people exactly like themselves. So this element is obviously something they keep in mind, so they have very clear ideas about where they would like to live, and they would never live. But it's always, or it generally is in this dimension of tolerating a certain degree of mixity, of diversity, to the extent that they can feel in control of that diversity. And then in some of the other dimensions that we analyze, partly related to the residential trajectory, we saw this. For example, another element we discussed with them was basically which were services in the territory. So what kind of use of public services they did. And here we could see very clearly this distance proximity tension, because they would go private in all those thought would expose them to too much diversity, if you want, in a way. But whenever they would feel more comfortable, because they would feel that the neighborhood was more like themselves, they would have no obstacle into using public services and not going private. So in a way, their going private is something that we include within the general logic of partial exit. Okay, they choose in a way to what extent they invest in their social spaces, depending on what is the composition of those groups. So another axis that we strongly focus on was basically their social networks. So who are the people these upper middle classes relate to in their daily lives? And this part of the questionnaire was very thorough and very long, and we asked these informants to tell us with whom do they do certain things, like going out, kind of socializing, spending time with, supporting each other, and we basically paid a lot of attention to this logic of the social dynamics that these groups develop, and there we could see again the importance of the family, very very central, the importance of their social networks, like who do they relate to in their normal lives, and probably we could say much more about that. Alberta is the expert on this particular dimension, but basically what we could see was that our informants are again not heroes of diversity. We could see that very often these upper middle classes relate to people like themselves. Of course, depending on which is their own social extraction, they will have more or less kind of interaction with people from lower social groups. But in general terms, there is a lot of homophily, like a lot of interaction with people exactly like themselves. We also asked them about their values in relation particularly to politics, the state, and markets. And we could realize that our upper middle classes are basically liberals. So they have an idea that the state is necessary to regulate markets, but they also think markets should play a very important role in society. So they are not kind of 100% in favor of obligate-driven and controlled society, but they are not also advocates of a minimal state. They're not neoliberals in that respect, and they understand quite well the need for an interaction, a dialogue between state and markets for the adequate functioning of the economy and of society. But in general terms, of course, they feel that their societies, and remember we are talking about France, Italy, and Spain, needed reform, and most of the time these reforms they were thinking about would be on the line of introducing more efficiency and better use of the resources, and maybe more role for markets, and maybe less rigidity from state administrations. But as I said, not radical neoliberals, but basically liberals in the traditional sense of the word. Then finally, we also asked them very thoroughly about their practices. I mentioned before the reference to public services, for example, but there were other things that we asked them about practices, and one of the most important were the ones that were related to the analysis of their openness to the world. So, for example, one key question that we asked them about was their traveling patterns, like where do they travel to, which cities they're well familiar with who, and where do they have friends abroad, and what kind of exposure they have to the international dimension. And linked to that, we also asked them about their media exposure, to what extent they watch foreign media, they read foreign newspapers, to what extent they look at the world in their daily lives and conceptualize their own societies as part of that whole. So basically, that's something that we were basically trying to grasp to what extent or informants would be what we could consider kind of virtual transnational people, basically being open to the world, even if relatively well rooted within their local societies. And this is something that we, in a way, could confirm by the empirical evidence that we gathered. Finally, we asked them also a lot about their children, to what extent they think they have to invest in their children, and they have to invest in their children transnational or cosmopolitan as well. And this came actually very clearly. I mean, in general terms, our managers would be themselves more or less international. There was variation there, but there was a unanimity in the logic that they had to project their children to become more transnational than they were, with the idea that they had to maximize this kind of, in a way, rent-seeking logic that they could extract from their exposure to the international dimension, in order, and again, always with the objective of maximizing their chances within their own areas. So, bottom line, I think I'm gonna kind of stop there with just some couple of concluding remarks. Basically, we claim that our partial exit strategy was confirmed by the empirical evidence that we collected from our informants. These groups were basically not kind of segregators either. They didn't want to live completely separated from the rest of society, but they were not kind of ignorant about the idea of who was living around them. Okay, they are very well aware of what kind of environments they want to live in, and this is very clear in their strategies of choosing their area of residence. They try to be very much in control of their social interaction with whom they interact, and we see this kind of homophily that I referred to before quite clearly. And we could also see the central importance that the family continues to play in this group, for this group. So basically, we could say that we do find that there is indications that we could be witnessing the emergence of a managerial class in Europe in the making. Okay, so we don't have this kind of group of Europeans disconnected from their own national societies, but opposite to that, we see people who are very well anchored in their cities and in their national societies, but also perfectly aware of the importance that Europe and globalization in general, but specifically Europe, plays within their own national societies, and the need to adapt to that. And again, they project that very strongly in relation to what they see as the future of their children. So with this, I would just basically stop and maybe open the floor so that Patrick may complement what I just said. Alberta is having some difficulties with her microphone, but maybe she can complement on chat if she considers that necessary. And otherwise, whenever the moderator Giovanni tells us, then we can just open the floor for the rest of the group. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Javier. And I think that Patrick can complement what we've just been hearing, and after we can open the floor. We have already one person which would like to intervene, which is Azat Gundogan. So after that Patrick makes this further introduction, we can give him the floor. Please, Patrick.
Thank you, Giovanni. I will say very little because it has always been done, and we want to hear the critics. So just to sum up what Javier has been saying, I'll just emphasize three things. Number one, this is comparative social urban research. Okay, we develop a framework, we have ideas, there is no data available, and instead of looking for many new fancy labels, we do serious empirical research, which is comparative, okay, in 3 countries, 3 languages, and it took us a long way. This is an empirical research with a very strong framework. That's the strength of this research. The second thing is, this is an urban research in many ways. We try to understand the urban as a place and in terms of relations, mobility, and that is articulation that makes the whole interest. which allows us to go beyond classic analysis of transformation of cities. For instance, you may have read there's an implicit criticism of a lot of gentrification. We think these new urban bourgeoisie are playing an important role in the transformation of city. And thirdly, we really try to articulate issues of mobility and transnationalism and rootedness, as Javier has said. But basically, we don't, because what we know about European societies, particularly in the southwest corner of Europe, we don't take mobility as life for granted. It makes sense in relation to logics of rootedness. So it's also a way to go beyond framework about the world is becoming mobile. I shut up. I want to hear all these questions. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Patrick. And the first question is by Azat Gutogan, and he's gonna write it on the chat board. So please, Azat, you have it here. And now one of you two can read it aloud to keep our audio file consistent, and the other can begin the answer, please. So I think
I'll read questions, the division of labor. Thanks. My question is about property ownership. What is the role of a type of property ownership and assets in the formation of groups, e.g. bank account saving or house ownership? Is there an overlap between the form of property or assets and the level of mobility and rootedness of these upper middle classes? How fixed is their assets and savings in space? Do they help their mobility or rootedness? Well, thank you, Azat. This is a very good question. Basically, we have not asked very specifically, explore that more than one thing. Basically, the people we study, and they are managers, most of them would own their house. Very rarely they rent it. Most of them have a property and they own a property. All right. So all we say at this level, and they are about 10% in the hierarchy of income. It's not a super elite of 1%, as you've seen. Most of them would own a property. So it doesn't make a big difference from that point of view. We have very clear ideas about their income. We know what they own in terms of houses, but we did not explore more precisely the question you asked, how liquid is and how spatially organized is their bank accounts and their money. For one simple reason, in many countries we study here, it was illegal to have, for instance, money in Swiss banks, and actually some of them have had problems. So it's very hard to do research just through interviews. Our method and the questionnaires and interviews would not be appropriate to explore specifically. All we can say is that for most of the people we dealt with, they may have some savings and some account, but when you are at the level of income that our managers are, some of them may have, for family reasons, some money and account abroad, but most of them, that will not be very important. Most of them, they are not part of these people having money all around the world. They have property and they have some account, but so we have not explored that, but we don't think that it was a key element for this population because they don't have enough assets or enough money to really play complex game in Paradise Island and events for money. But it's something that should be explored. I would imagine that those who have money in foreign countries will have more facility or open account in foreign countries to be mobile. But I think the causality would be the other way. It's because they are mobile that they would try to get money in foreign account. So I would not see that as a causality, but it's something to be explored. It's a very good point.
If I may add another kind of take into the question, certainly Italy and Spain, to some extent also France, are countries in which ownership house is a very top priority for people and for households. And it has been discussed often that this introduces rigidity in these societies, in the sense that people are obviously less mobile. Whenever they have already their own house, they are less willing to actually move abroad, certainly, or even to other cities within the same country. So in a way, the fact that average in Spain is 85% of people own their own house, In Italy, I think it's quite similar. In France, it's probably a bit lower, but still quite significant percentage of people own their house. So yes, this may be an element that introduces rigidity. But another dimension that was very relevant for us, I would say, was precisely which were the limits that or informants had when choosing an apartment. And we did ask them whether money was an issue, whether they looking for neighborhoods that were of a certain range of price, and how did they perceive these kind of neighborhoods in relation to their own social status. So we were looking at what did our informants had in mind when they were thinking about the place where they would put their money, which neighborhoods they would be willing to invest a significant amount of money to buy their house there. And yes, for them, the neighborhoods that they considered desirable were expensive neighborhoods, but neighborhoods that were at the same time safe. While whenever we asked them to which neighborhoods you would never move in, very often there were neighborhoods that were much cheaper, so where they could easily buy a very large apartment, but they would not consider that desirable, and probably at the same time they would consider that as a less safe investment. So within their general financial strategies, home ownership is a very central one, and living in neighborhoods in which they feel comfortable is part of that kind of safe strategy of investment that they have in mind.
All right, does it make sense?
Okay, so Azat just is giving some feedback. If
Maybe
only
just a small
you
comment.
could ask such a questions. Thanks a lot
Maybe
for the answers.
A small comment on
Okay.
Azat's, you just added something. I think in terms of method, it's an important point, you cannot get that through asking questions. If you want to really research on that, you need to get access, and that's more or less possible now with justice. And remember the investigation about the HSBC bank, which advised many people all around the world to get illegal money in Switzerland. You have to look through these sort of sources, looking at the justice, looking at some of the agreement with banks, and to do work along those lines to answer your question. I don't think you can get that through questionnaire, which is an interesting subject. All right, next question. Thank you.
Okay, next question. It's by Spinak, and she's gonna write it as well. So we will need to read it.
All right.
Please, Abby,
Okay.
You can write it down. Okay, it arrived. One of the two authors can read it like before, and the other can begin to answer. So we're a switch of voices.
Okay, I'll read that. Thanks for sharing the book with us. I feel like the last couple of weeks of our seminar have been about holding up sensationalist claims about globalization to scrutiny and showing how actual global urban modernity is much more place-specific and complicated than some sort of new master narrative of mobility. And I really appreciate this approach. Thank you, Eddie. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how this study influenced your theoretical thinking on class division. You start by talking about some of the challenges in defining middle class, and your conclusions show that it is indeed a very hybrid thing, especially on the issue of how much this manager class is and feels in control of its social and economic world. Building on this study, how would you encourage new projects to investigate middle classes? Thank you. Do I start, Javier?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So that was a key concern of this book. I must also tell you that, unfortunately, Alberta is not able to contribute, but we have lots of debate on how to deal with this element. So if we come back at the beginning of the book, because you've read that, the idea in particular was to contribute indeed to some of the questions about class and groups and the making of social groups. And as you know, there are lots of debate that we review a bit briefly, but precisely in the book. The first thing which is central, 2 points were central to us. The first one is to understand group making. You cannot just look at the national structure. You have to take that into account, but you have to look, and we are following, in particular, the work of Michael Savage, the choice of location and the investment in some large cities or second-size cities is one part of the class making and is central for the reproduction of this group. I take a group or class, I'm hesitating. So if we take into account this reproduction element, which is central in class analysis, then this urban dimension is absolutely central. The second thing, and the hypothesis we had, is that we think that in terms of class dimension and group making, you cannot just look at a structure at a given moment and only follow the sort of social mobility type of analysis that I studied a long time ago in Oxford. You need to take into account some of the new transformation and different forms of capitalism and economic development. Of course, we do not explore that precisely. We limit our analysis to those managers. But also, we argue that mobility, that's the hypothesis, is one of the new cleavage. So in a way, our hypothesis is that within existing national groups or class structure, we suggest, we review also the work of Chiesi, among others, that there may be a cleavage in the making, meaning that those who are transnationally mobile accumulate a number of resources. They see themselves as the avant-garde of globalization, and therefore they oppose and are in conflict to some other fractions of the middle class and the upper middle class that are more rooted in the values, in the hierarchy, in the prestige, in the income distribution of a national structure. So our hypothesis is the changing scale having some consequence on transformation of the national hierarchies and social order. And the idea that some groups, that mobility being a new cleavage, we would see the structuring of a more mobile middle class group that will be different from the rest of the middle class. This hypothesis has not proved completely accurate. In many ways, that's the title of the book, Globalized Minds, Roots in the City. Those who are not mobile, in fact, seem to have, not exactly, but not far away, all of the group we are studying, they see themselves very much part of globalization. So one characteristics of this group is to represent itself as the avant-garde of the own society that is helping the modernization of society against the rest, which is not being adapted to new times. And all the figures we put forward about, for instance, globalization, by contrast to the rest of the national societies, this group is saying globalization is good for you and is very important, and my children will be ready. And blimey, all this, the rest of society is backward and not adapted. There's a very clear representation on their role and also on the transformation of society. So this representation element of their role in their society, in the world, is a very strong unifying group. And for us, what was striking was that they were very similar, very comparable analysis and view of their own situation in the three countries. So this representation, or we part of the globalization process, we are pushing, we are preparing, we are ready to do it, is one element going to maybe this transformation of the social class structure and the making of some European class structure, making the elements suggesting the making of an urban middle class at the European level. So in terms of theory, for us, the most important point is scale, is to understand how some social groups articulate those different scales. That's why in the book we emphasize, number one, this transnational element, and second, this urban element, because they have some clear way to invest in their cities and to be rooted. And again, with differences, in the four cities, we see, at least for this southwest corner of Europe, very clear similar element. This is not, the people we study, those sort of 10%, they are not secession. They are not going to live in complete enclaves. There are some exceptions, but the logics, as Javier has precisely mentioned in the introduction, is rather to try to get the best of the city. They see their friends, they have families, they have dense social networks, they try to use a lot of public services. they play this complex game of distance and proximity that we have tried to analyze. And I think it's a very particular European way of using the city, Britain being the exception as usual. A way to not, they're not flying far away in faraway suburbs. That's not what they're doing. They are trying to play, they are very much investing resources. So I think what you see is not just a general theory of middle class in the making. What we see is for Europe, for continental Europe, and I think there are some elements in the UK too, very different from what you see in the US or what I've been looking at in Mexico, Sao Paulo. You see some of this upper middle class clearly being more and more transnational, a little bit with their practice, very much with their representation, clearly significating a cleavage from those who do not understand those things, and second, remaining in a classically European way, very rooted in their territory. So I think in class theory, that is pushing towards taking into account both mobility and the way they are rooted and playing the game in the city. So it's very similar to what Max Savage has been arguing from Manchester. And I think that's quite a different take on the thinking about class that we see in a lot of a class analysis in at least in the European debate, but also in the American debate. So that's where we would like to go forward. So how would we go further? Well, to go further, we would like to ask far more questions, class specific. Number one, you have to compare these groups both with the more elite, the top 1%, and with some other groups in society. So one of our frustration is that we could not do a very parallel research with some other group to really see whether this group is distinguishing itself from other groups in society, both in practice and in values and in networks, the three dimensions we have. The second dimension would be to push a little bit more about their self-representation. We didn't ask them whether they felt middle class, their own view of their position in the social hierarchy. And the third one would be to be more systematic on a number of other elements of the class I mentioned, including cultural practices and all sorts of things. So, if you do a class project, you could use some of the results of what we've been doing and then to push to investigate more systematically some of this middle class element, including in terms of trajectories and the result for the children and where the children would go. One hypothesis we have that we have not explored so much, we have a little bit of data but not enough, is what happens to the children of these people. And for instance, we have some little indications in the qualitative analysis. Those who were over 60, their children would be adult and would work already. And what we saw sometimes is that some of the people we interviewed said that those were very transnational. A lot of their children were also very transnational. That's a very strong hypothesis to test whether we have a reproduction of the most transnational people, and that would go towards the idea of the making of a European or global urban middle classes. So that's the sort of things I would like to explore if we were to push this project further. Maybe Alberta can write a couple of lines and disagree on this thing. Okay, so there's a comment. Alberta, or everybody can read Alberta. Giovanni, shall we read?
Well, as soon as she writes something, relevant, yes. Alberta, you can write it down if you want, intervene, and we can read it aloud if you want. In the meanwhile,
I would like to add something, so maybe Alberta can write it in the meantime and then post it all together. And I would just would like to add some small comment to the last point that Patrick was making. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, this research has been going on for a very long time. So we started doing it at some point in the mid-2000s. And in the meantime, lots of things have changed, or at least they seem to have changed in many ways. So one of the things I think would be interesting to analyze and to look at is to what extent the current crisis that we have been in for the last 6 years is actually a game.
Hello?
I've lost you, Javier.
Yes, I think we lost him.
My God, 3 offers, 2 are done already. What a group.
Okay.
Meanwhile,
There was arriving the writing from Alberta. I can read it aloud this time. Alberta Andreotti writes, I agree totally with Patrick.
I am back. Can I?
You're back, Francisco.
I don't know what happened. I'll be very brief, just 1 minute. I would like to say that, in a way, an additional research to the one we have been doing could also demystify this idea that the current crisis is actually narrowing down the middle classes, and is basically, in a way, particularly hitting the middle classes. And there is some evidence already indicating that is actually not really the case. The groups that are suffering more directly from the crisis are actually the bottom third. The 3 lowest deciles of the distribution of income are the ones that are more directly hit by the crisis. It is true that the middle classes are having difficulties to have their children, their kids, basically access the type of jobs they would expect. And it's precisely in these middle classes that we see more mobility. And I'm talking particularly about the case of Spain, but I'm sure it's also the case in Italy. So it's the children of the middle classes, and probably also the children of these managers we interview, that are even more strongly directed towards mobility practices, mobility strategies, in order to try to remain in their social group, their social class, and even try to progress within it. So I think this remains to be researched. What is the impact of the crisis? What is the role that mobility may be playing for these younger cohorts that basically belong into this social strata, and which will be their capacity to join in the ranks of the social groups to which they belong to? And I think that will be very interesting research that, in a way, would follow ours.
Yeah. Very good point. Very good point.
Okay, who is going to read Alberta's comments now?
Okay, I'll read that. Alberta writes, I agree totally with Patrick. For once, it happens. Yes, I wanted to mention the importance of country patterns and their socioeconomic structure. For instance, for Italy, entrepreneurs are socially important because the Italian economic structure, managers in Italy did not feel really the avant-garde. They feel the shadow of entrepreneurs. They feel to be the ones changing the country. This is why it would be interesting to compare managers with entrepreneurs in Italy. Because even in Italy, managers often want to create their own company despite difficulties. So I think she's right. This is an important point. This combination of class structure can take different forms within the national structure that are changing slowly. Okay, that's it.
Okay, that's fine. We can pass the floor now to Sara Linama. I'm trying to open her microphone to see if she can intervene orally with us. Sara, can you speak?
Yes, hello.
Oh, great. Welcome.
Hello, Sara. Welcome.
Thank you so much for this fascinating study. And if I can just agree with Abby, how I really appreciate how it challenges assumptions and presumptions made within urban sociology and discourses of globalization and cosmopolitanism and mobility. So it's really well done in that respect. But I'd like to ask a fairly general question. Now, you mentioned in the book how comparative research is always, quote, fraught with difficulties. Could you share with us some of the conversations you had around the method design and some of the challenges of the comparative dimension?
Oh, yeah. Who wants to start on this one? Javier, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Things, and then you build on that. Up to today, this remains an open issue for discussion within us, like to what extent our research has proven strong enough in the kind of data we managed to generate, and partly the reason for this general discussion has to do with the extreme difficulty of collecting this kind of data. So we tried, as I said before, to combine both quantitative and qualitative methods in 3 different languages, in 16 different neighborhoods. It was quite difficult to actually process this information and and of course compare it later. There were issues of to what extent a question would make sense in another language, adapt it, and then we had the problems of coding the answers because they were not exactly answering the same question. So you can imagine that was a very big challenge. It was very gratifying to be able to produce this big database that we generated with the quantitative data, for example, but still quite frustrating very often. Same goes for the data on social networks, which is basically what Alberta was very much interested in. And that was extremely difficult to generate all these very detailed questions to people about their daily lives and the daily practices, and how difficult it was to keep them on board in the research. Then, of course, we had the whole issue of the statistical representativity of what we were doing. And after all, we had roughly 500 interviews. And of course, the treatment that we could give to this kind of data from a quantitative point of view is relatively limited. We cannot kind of extract conclusions from these cases into a very general law-making effort. So all these things were constant discussions that we had together, and the conclusion that we normally arrived to was, okay, we do the best we can with this evidence that is limited in a way, is exploratory in many ways, but at the same time is very rich in detail. And again, this brings me to the discussion on how difficult it was to actually analyze the qualitative part of all these nearly 500 interviews. And how challenging it was to kind of make sense of that material, and at the same time how kind of gratifying it was to actually have it. So I think comparative analysis of this kind are extremely important, very necessary, very useful, but very, very complex to handle. And this research was done practically without money, so it was done with very little economic resources, but it took therefore an awful lot of time, so it's very time consuming as well. You may derive the conclusion that I'm trying to discourage you from doing this kind of work, very much.
Yeah. Let me sound a more optimistic note on that.
Yes.
Number one, as you probably know, in urban studies, there are not so many good comparative work. Okay, it's not so well known, and part of this project was also a dissatisfaction with some of the European projects we have been involved in the past, where you have 2 or 3 years to gather a lot of data, and then you just analyze, you publish your thing, and that's it. I think, again, the point about this book is that we went for some original thinking about the framework we had. There was no data being available, and we produced our own data. Okay, so that takes a lot of time. We had some money, but not enough comparing to what we wanted to do. The second thing is, all of us were already comparative scholars. And we say it takes 10 years to be a good comparativist, but we really decided to go slowly also because we did it extremely seriously and in depth. We worked on the categories. We spent a lot of time on the questionnaires to make sure we explore the questionnaire in the 3 countries. Then we developed the same methodology to analyze the data. Of course, the qualitative data was in Spanish, in Italian, and French, and all of us were more or less at ease with the 3 languages. We had 16 neighborhoods. So Alberta and Javier came to Paris and visited all the neighborhoods. We all went to Milan and to Madrid and to lesser extent to Lyon and visited all these neighborhoods. So we did a very in-depth work to be really familiar with the 3 countries, the 4 cities, and to systematically analyze the qualitative and the quantitative data with a very strong knowledge of the class analysis of all the sort of subjects we have been studying. And over time, our hypothesis and interpretation varied. It took us a long time to write for very simple reasons. It's that the analysis was, again, in Spanish, French, and Italian, and then we wrote in English. So you need a lot of interpretation and time to be very precise on what you say, what you interpret, and what you analyze. So this is sort of long, in-depth comparison. We were already, I said, comparative scholars wanted to do something as precise and as in-depth as possible with original data. And when you bring in original data that has not been done for this sort of research, of course, it takes quite a lot of time. So there was a lot of discussion on the method, because we have a convenience sample, and we chose 30 interviews per neighborhood selected along very precise criteria, but this is not a representative sample. So we had a lot of discussion on how far we can go to generalize the data that we have been gathering. But one of the strong points we had is that we knew very well all the research being done in the 3 countries in the research and in England, and we were able to compare with on some precise questions. So one strategy we had, for instance, on the questions about value, we took the questions coming from the European Social Survey, ESS, meaning that we could compare our result with representative samples being done in each country. So we could check out that the data we have for our group made a lot of sense and was very compatible with what the general ESS data was giving. So we had a different strategy to make sure that our convenience sample was not completely irrelevant, but it is not a representative sample. We also had some doubt in terms of method to compare in the analysis of networks, because asking questions about who are your best friends, who are your brothers and sisters, how often you live, what sort of things you change with them, is very painful when you do the interview. Each interview was on average 90 minutes. And we're not entirely sure that the pain we had to ask all the long questions was worth it. But that's, to Alberta, we did it, and it was actually one of the most interesting results. So I would really, one of the results for us in this comparative research is to emphasize how productive and fruitful it is to combine some very crude figures and get some very clear questions to be able to have some form of quantification of some of the results on the value, but also the practice. How often do you go to cinema? How often do you see your brothers and sisters? Where do your best friends live? So I have a lot of very clear, precise questions to get some analysis and to be able to compare the results in a systematic way. Second, we had a lot of richness from the qualitative data. We had lots of open questions about why did they choose to live in this neighborhood, a bit about their life trajectories, about the balance between work and family, about their experience and why they wanted to live in a foreign country. And that was extremely rich as a complement or as the same level of analysis as the quantitative. And thirdly, we had the network analysis. And this analysis of the network was a formidable complement to the 2 other ones. So can I really emphasize that in this sort of comparative research, mixing different type of data that we get from the questionnaire prove extremely long to analyze, but also useful to do the research. So the research has limit. It deals with the southwest of Europe, but it is a measure, as we do in physics. It is not a representative sample, it's a measure. And it gives us some extremely solid base upon which we can build on other things. Already we have debate with our colleagues in Britain, and we see that some of the things actually might be more similar in Britain than thought by both the British and by us. And I suspect it would make a lot of sense to do a similar research in the north of Europe, and it would work extremely well as well. But the idea was to compare 3 countries, 4 cities in depth with, knowing the data, knowing the research, knowing the neighborhoods, investing a lot of time then to interpret the data in the 3 languages. So it took a lot of time, it must be said. On the other end, I was thinking sometimes if we had a huge amount of money and we would have done the research much more quickly, what was striking for us also is that how over the years, we would meet 3 times a year or something, we really made progress in the sharpness of our hypothesis, in the interpretation, and in getting results that for us are extremely clear at the end of the day. So in a way, it's a plea for not years as we did, but at least 5 years research project, where you take time to produce original data of different nature, and then you take time to analyze and to work on the data. For me, the strength of the research in the book, and where I'm very, very pleased and proud of, is the fact that the 3 of us, we spend a lot of time together just discussing what we interpret, how we understood some of the data, looking back to the data, thinking about the figures, re-listening to the questionnaire, to the interviews, and just the depth of the analysis of the data of different nature, and the way our exchange between the three of us was just formidable intellectual experience then to write the book. So that's what I would say. Comparative research requires a little bit of time and different type of data gathering. It should also be a bit more, and that's my last point. I think in comparative research, I'm following very much my friend Jenny Robinson, who has written a couple of papers on comparative research. We have to open a little bit the way we do comparative research and not just compare similar case, but we have to combine different type of scales. The difficulty of this comparative research was not just to compare neighborhoods or just to compare city, was to articulate the way these middle class people were living in neighborhoods at the urban level, in national societies, and feeling part of Europe and the global world. And I think that's what you need to do in comparative research. It's always to think about place, scales, and relations. And I'm not sure we have yet a very clear method for that, but clearly this book is an effort to formalize a method and a framework to combine these three dimensions together. That's not just comparative research, it's just comparative research taking into account the scale element and the relational element. And that's, I think, where the book, it works very well. That's where I'm very pleased with the book, is that we've managed to keep those different elements together. Because at the end of the day, we compare 16 neighborhoods, we compare 4 cities, and we compare 3 countries. So that's a lot of comparative work at different scale for different research questions that you have to held together. That was very demanding in terms of thinking and analysis. And that's where 3 of us working together was a formidable addition. None of us could have done 20% of the work in terms of capacity to develop collective ideas that we've done together. This is really the work of a group in that context. So my advice in comparative research, work with excellent people and get a very, very good group of people you can work in depth for a long time. And that has been one of the most satisfying elements for us.
Thank you. You make us eager to work with you, actually. You described this.
Well, yeah, Alberta is very expensive, that's a problem. I'm joking.
That's great, because it's very nice while you work also enjoy this. You can feel the passion in it. Sarah, would you like to give some feedback to this?
Thank you very much. That was an excellent answer. And yes, I will start assembling my team now and spend the next 5 to 10 years on this, on a new project.
You could do on some smallest project. It depends which project you do.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to you, Sarah, as well. And now we have another comment by Olivier Roy Bayargon, but he's gonna write it down so we can see it on the chat room.
Okay. Do you want me to read?
Yes.
Okay. Olivier, thank you for your question. The fact that your managers, even when they work for private firms, are not neoliberal zealots, as they tend to support the welfare state and ask for more effective and efficient public services, yet struck me as a North American. What part of a center-left social democratic political stance is to be attributed to the Europeanity, according to you? In other words, do you think your result would have been very different on that aspect if you had rather interviewed managers from, say, New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, and Toronto? Well, Javier, you spend more time than me in the US, so maybe you could answer that, and then I will give you my take.
Okay. I would say yes, certainly it would have been very different. In a way, this is what Patrick was saying before. Like, this is a research that talks about a specific corner of southwestern Europe. We started with the idea that the UK was very different from us, and then, as Patrick was saying, in more recent discussions with British colleagues, we can see that there may be a few more parallelisms that we initially thought, but still Britain remains quite different to southwestern European countries that we included in our research. So different if we would look at Northern European countries or Eastern European countries. And of course, if we move across the Atlantic and we talk to North American managers, it would certainly be very different. So what I was trying to say before, and what we tried, is that our managers are not neoliberals in the sense that they don't want to dismantle the state. They appreciate many of the things that the state does for them, does for their societies, kind of in a way, the kind of problems the state can solve in interaction with markets. So they are very clear also about the need for markets to intervene in the provision of many public goods, and how this interaction between states and markets is actually fundamental. Then, of course, there may be different equilibriums between them, different balances of how this interaction of these two main actors should be balanced. But bottom line, we could see that they were very clearly taking a stand along the traditional liberal ideological approach to these issues. And in this respect, we could claim that they are more center-right than the societies in which they belong to. They do often think of themselves as these actors with a clear idea of how their society should be reformed and transformed and changed, and they emphasize issues having to do with the need to change the education system, with the need to sometimes streamline the state bureaucracies, sometimes privatize certain dimensions in which the state may still be playing a role. But having said that, they do think they know how their states, their countries could be reformed, they are still relatively satisfied with the fact that the welfare state exists and it provides certain safety nets that make their societies more comfortable to live in, because they tame inequalities and because they solve the provision of certain public goods that it's well known that when the market deals with them, they become much more inefficient and much more expensive, like healthcare, for example, right? So in this respect, they are relatively moderate, and they don't promote a more neoliberal approach to these dimensions. All of these things in the US probably would be quite different, because the ideological substrate is very different, and it's the current equilibrium between state and markets is also quite radically different. And in a way, that's the environment in which they have managed to grow and thrive and occupy their position. So they may be dissatisfied with the way certain things work, but I don't foresee them asking for a much more radical intervention of the state, for example, in certain dimensions. But this is only an hypothesis in a way, and it will be certainly extremely interesting to check and to contrast this with our results. So, Patrick, maybe you want to nuance this.
Yep. I think number one, I think it's a great question, and if you fancy, I think you should try this research with us on the US case and Canada. That would be wonderful. So I like this question. I would say 3 points. Number one, in urban studies, because after all you are urban scholars, most of you, there is an overemphasis on convergence. Okay, there is always an attempt to try to show that the rest of the world is going a little bit. So we tend either to emphasize things are very different, so contexts are different, and you look at the local neighborhood, which is completely particular. I always mock my friend in Chicago because they tend to study Chicago and Chicago. I call them Chicagologists. And then the other group of researchers just look at convergence, and all the world is following the same path. And of course, I would see myself, and the three of us, I think, as comparative social scientists, trying to understand some of these dynamics of convergence with some theory, and also take into account the long historical trajectories of the society. So Europe is not the US. Okay, it's a very important point. And the UK is in between in some way. So just think in political terms. You have a UK election taking place in 2 weeks' time. Clearly, the left party in the UK, the Labour Party, would be a right-wing party in most Western Europe. So historically, Europe was a place where the Industrial Revolution played a more important role. So we had stronger working class, stronger social democratic parties, stronger extreme left, stronger trade unions, number one. And second, the state is older and played a more important role, hence the importance of the welfare state. So, and thirdly, they are very territorialized society with old regions and cities. So when you put the three things together, the structure, the social structure, and the regulations in Europe, remember that Europe is the land of public policy. On average, if you take a simple indicator like public expenditure related to GDP, figures has been about 32% in the US because of the war, 33, but in Europe it's on average 45, and UK is below, it's 41. So it's between 45 and 50%, meaning that you have 20 points of GDP every year in public expenditure, more than in the US. European societies are far more structured by public policy, semi-public organization, the welfare state, in all sorts of ways. Good or bad, it's a different story, and the level of inequalities has been historically much, much lower than in the US. Even with the crisis, if you look at the Gini indicator, there are far less inequalities in Europe than in the US, although it is now increasing, in particular with the crisis, and it's far from being perfect. So we are in very different societies. And the way what we try to do with this research is develop tools to see some element of change at the European scale, but also maybe beyond that. So, point one, convergence. Second, on neoliberalism. I'm just writing a paper on neoliberalism in urban studies, where I tend to argue that I like very much my friend, the work of my friends Neil Brenner, Theodore and Peck, but in a lot of the urban studies thing, the understanding of neoliberalism is very, very poor, very weak. It doesn't explain very much. It's a sort of posturing thing. So you need to be precise on this neoliberal thing, but we don't do in the book. So I think the answers would have been very different in the US for different reasons. Number one, those managers are much more organized. Their life is more organized with private regulations, from pensions to schools, to universities. They are not socialized with the same level of public services. So all this dimension which we show for Europe is different. Second, some of the issues related to climate change, which are becoming very central, would be also quite different. So I think Javier is quite clear. The dominant view of European middle class is more liberal in many ways than neoliberal. And I'm not entirely sure we would have the same result in the UK. Actually, I'm quite sure we would not have the same result in the UK. It will be very polarized in the UK. And I'm quite convinced you're quite right. We'll have very different answers in the US case for all sorts of reasons. One nuance maybe in my analysis, and Alberta, if she could speak, would have said that very rightly. In the case of Milan, we saw element of some of these middle class, upper middle classes, that were, in a way, following a more American path, being a little bit more remote from the city, and valorizing a little bit more some of these neoliberal ideas and practices. And then you see the influence of Berlusconi and type of project clearly have a role. And so in Italy, in Milan, there were some elements going along those lines. So my answer is I don't know at all. I suspect it will be very different in the US case. Canada may be more polarized as well. If you're in Montreal or in Toronto, you get very different answers as well. I would love to see comparative research in those terms. But clearly, on a number of issues, the class structure, public services, the territorialization, the importance of some of the private market regulations for a number of domains, we are in very different world, and we must always remember that. Are changing, and Europe is becoming a more market-oriented society, a bit, not a huge amount, but a bit. And therefore, there may be some convergence in the making, and the crisis has accelerated this to some extent, but they are very different social world, and that should be explored more systematically. And we lack a very systematic comparative research between North America and Europe on this sort of account. Welcome to join us. Just If you're ready, we can think about it.
Be aware that our participants are very, very active. So
okay, we should answer shortly.
Lots of description for this.
Okay, so we'll try to give short answers. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Now we have one question by Lydia Manzo, and I'm gonna open her microphone so she can try to speak with us. Please, Lydia.
I think Lydia's written a question.
Lydia? Yes, I know, but she told me she had also the possibility of speaking. So
listening to Lydia.
But she's not. Lydia, are you there? Okay, since she posted her question, we can read it. And
okay.
We go on.
Lydia questions. I was wondering about this sort of very interesting paradox of being an avant-garde group and at the same time taking care of family ties. I'm especially interested indeed in questioning the centrality of family in the choice of location. And yes, Francisco Javier, I think that one of the most interesting results would come nowadays from young people, whom I think are one of the group most hit by the GSC. Getting practical, I found in a recent field research conducted in Milan that exactly the middle-class young people, 1835, feel very much constrained. I mean, like trapped between family support and other sources of social ties and the opportunity to leave the country for better job opportunities. In this context, again, housing opportunity provided by the family of origin in different forms might reshape their mobility, cosmopolitan aspirations. It would be very useful for me to discuss this if you have any findings coming from the interview collection, even if not already connected with the crisis. Thank you. Well, the one to answer the question is Alberta. So I suggest Alberta is going to write a very precise answer on these things. Can I just start quickly, but then Javier will say something, to say that that's one of our frustration, meaning that at the time when we finished the interviews, the crisis was starting to develop more and more strongly. So that's the problem of waiting a bit too long. And clearly we have been discussing a lot this effect of the crisis on this issue. You know, this is an open question and an empirical question. It might be the case that the model we identify will completely blown up because of the crisis. It might be the case that what we've seen, particularly in Spain, in Italy, in France to some extent, we see that these young people are exiting following what you have been mentioning for job reasons, and they may not come back. We also think that maybe this model will be more robust. You know, what the conclusion we have is that Europe is changing slowly, and it's an incremental, slow change over time. And maybe those people will go away, and if and only if the situation gets better, they may come back afterwards. That would be the logic of our model. And my own take would be, maybe we'll see both. We'll see some people leaving for good, and some people will come back when things get better. I think you should not. One of the big question here is whether the new generation is different. And just to remind you this issue of generation. Sometimes people get very obsessed by the generation. Young people are very different, they do things differently, and things will change dramatically. You know, in the late 70s, the Germans were very worried about all these young German squatters and not answering census and developing alternative way of life. Yeah, all these young people, lots of them were involved in the green movement that has made some change in Germany. But most of them bought a house, had a family, and bought an Audi car. So, you know, we'll see over time whether it's a bit of a different generation or a completely different generation. It may also be the case that in aging European societies, the crisis has overemphasized tension between over 60 years old group that have become more reactionary, They are not supporting redistribution anymore, less and less so, except for pensions. And then the tension between the young generation, more mobile, and the old generation may become again a crucial conflict and cleavage within European societies. I don't know. I think the two hypotheses are possible, and we should try to develop research to understand this very precisely. Alberta is making a number of points as I speak. Maybe I'll read that, because I think Giovanni said we have to read these things for the official recording. Alberta said, we made the interviews before the crisis, so it is clear that family plays a crucial role in both supporting and constraining. Family seems to be much more important for middle-class young people, as it is the family who is helping young people not to prevent experiencing downward mobility when it manages. In selecting the neighborhood of residence, family was the first criterion in Milan. And I think it's a general statement that Alberta is making. One of the incredibly strong results of our research was the extent to which family was still central in all the social life of our middle class. And not just, extremely strong networks as we saw in Milan, but also in Spain and France, we saw traces of family. My favorite example are the middle classes in Lyon, where all of them, except one, they were in Lyon in relation to some family reasons. Not always because they came from Lyon, but sometimes the family was 2 hours away, and they wanted to be in the same region, not too close to their parents, but not too far away. So traces of family, weak family ties, played a very important role, including in Paris, and not just the strong family ties that you see in Milan. So my advice for any research you do on these things is always look very precisely at these family connections and support, because even for upper middle class, even for young people, this is absolutely central, at least for the part of the world we've been studying, but I suspect in many other parts of the world. Javier, you want to say something more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an extremely interesting comment, certainly. But I was trying to sound a bit kind of skeptical about this idea that this is changing so radically, and because of the crisis. And I remember very well that when we were doing the research, I was particularly puzzled by the contrast between Milan and Madrid, because being both societies with a Mediterranean family welfare regime and with more or less similar kind of economic type of structure, the difference in the mood between the managers that Alberta was interviewing at the time and the mood in the Spanish managers was very radical. Like, Spain was booming at the time, and our managers were very optimistic and positive about the Spanish economy and the future, and they were relatively very optimistic, while the Italian ones were already quite gloomy about the prospects for Italy. And I remember I was quite puzzled, and I remember talking to Alberta about that, and she said that many of her informants were telling her that the future was abroad, that there was nothing that could be done in Italy, that there was no future. And in that context, this idea of going out and the need to be mobile, it was quite kind of evident in the Italian case. At the same time, it didn't mean that they were more mobile than the Spanish ones. They were probably even a bit less so. So I don't know. I'm a bit puzzled about this idea that kind of the crisis, which at the time was already apparently present in the Italian mentality, is kind of pushing people so much to go out. In a way, we could say that now we have converged, because now the mood in Spain is gloomy, is also pessimistic, and in that way we have in a way merged with the Italian general atmosphere. And now we certainly discuss a lot about how many middle class young people are leaving the country and going abroad for looking for better opportunities. But again, going back to my initial argument, I would be skeptical about whether this means that these people are leaving for good. I think what they're doing is for research. They're trying to capitalize on their assets, basically. The fact that most of them have university degrees already, the fact that most of them speak foreign languages already, and this going out is perceived in many instances as a possibility of basic new professional qualifications that then they can cash in the future, when it is true many of them may not come back. But I would say that most will certainly try to come back. And if they have managed to do that, to go out for a certain period of time and then come back, in a way, I would claim that they have been able to do that precisely because of their social background, precisely because of to which social class they belong to. And I would certainly say, and I've been working on this for some other research about the composition, the social composition of those Spanish young people living the country, and we can see that there is a massive middle class groups and a clear infra-representation of working classes. So this migration that we are experiencing in Spain is very different from the one we had in the 1960s, for example. Middle class now may be actually something that may allow young people to consider living, partly because they think or they count on the existence of that their parents may provide for them while they're out, but particularly when they decide to come back. So I don't know. This is certainly a very interesting topic of research, and I think quite a lot should be done about this, actually.
Javier, did you finish?
Yes. There is a new entry by Alberta. Maybe Patrick wants to read it, or I can read it, whatever you want.
Read it, Javier. Go ahead.
Okay, so Alberta just added something saying, maybe where the crisis is important is in the partial exit strategy. Before, managers went abroad with the idea of coming back. Now, the discourses are to leave and to stay abroad, also in Milan. So kind of like the pessimistic mood seems to have become more prevalent, and the notion that they may come back is perceived as more remote and less likely.
Yeah, I can confirm that. In Italy, in this moment, most of the even intellectuals are looking abroad as a definitive solution, more than a way of improving their career and coming back after some time. It's nearly this pessimistic perspective on the future of the country. It's very strong and growing. For what I can say.
Giovanni, let's sound a positive note. Imagine that the troubled university system that you have at the moment is being reshaped in the next 5 years, and that the government decides to invest massively in the university system and create a lot of new opportunities. I would suspect that lots of people who today share this view will come back.
Yes, but that's an utopia.
It's a big if.
Yes, because there is no absolutely political intention of doing that. The opposite. It's more likely that they are reducing investment on research and university more than increasing it. So I mean, it's for what I can see, it's almost impossible that this happens with actual, let's say, political framework. Okay, Emily Rosman, she raised her hand. Emily, if you are able to speak, I'm opening your microphone. Otherwise, you can write your question or your comment there. Okay, Emily cannot speak. So she's writing. This time I can read it aloud for you so that you can rest a bit. Thanks so much, Emily says, for this fascinating study. This kind of detailed data, it's amazing. I wonder if you can make some comments about how the upper middle class lifestyles you observe are made possible or conditioned by the polarization of European cities in terms of politics and immigration. From your interviews or your analysis, can you comment on how the labor and lifestyles of the lower classes, who are potentially more rooted in place, support the lifestyles of the upper middle classes? I think a relation approach to a class-based analysis here is crucial to revealing the full extent of these social relations.
I think you're quite right. I think you're absolutely right. What we have not, because this research is focused on the upper middle class, we have not looked precisely in parallel to other social groups. But you are absolutely right that if we wanted to be more precise on both urban middle class in the city and the transformation of those cities, this is exactly what we would have to do. And when we do class analysis and studying metropolis or cities as society, that's what has to be done. What we show in the research is what we call this game of distance and proximity, and Javier has written particularly about that, is the extent to which this game of control is very strong. So they can choose, because they have a resource, the neighborhoods they want to live in. Remember that the polarization of European cities is a little bit of a complex issue. A lot of results, it depends, Brussels is different, there are a few exceptions, but the classic results is to show that European cities have gone towards more, there's an awful word in French, say moyennisation, meaning you have more and more, in class terms, not in ethnic terms, rather less polarization of European cities, except at the extreme being the top 1%, which is more and more living in enclaves, and the bottom, let's say 5% of the poorest people who are more and more marginalized and creating some poor enclaves as well. So the overall picture is not good or bad, it's a mix of both. You have less polarization in the sort of the dual society 50-50, but more polarization at the extreme. And in a way, that's the upper middle class we're studying are very ambiguous. In a way, they don't want to be 1% completely isolated, and they want to be part of society as long as they can go their own way. They can exclude people as much as they want from the school system, from some public space, or some practices, and they remain in control. And second, there is the ethnic dimension, which has become very central, and where polarization is far more pronounced. Again, it depends a lot from one city to the next, but it is quite clear that those upper middle class have benefited from some of the cheap services provided by poorer immigrants. So part of their lifestyle can be explained in those relational terms that you are analyzing. However, I will not go too far either. Part of a lifestyle is about having your friends and family around, and that's not exactly explained by this class dimension. So it's both, it's 50-50, or not 50-50, but both answers go together. Yes. And also you have to remember that part of a lifestyle they enjoy, including access to public services, including access to transport, to good hospitals, to this sort of things that are public, sometimes semi-public, semi-private, are funded by the state. So, and they pay taxes for that. So, part of a lifestyle is also a way to be able to take advantage of good public services when they exist, but they pay for those. So, yes, one part of the story is this relation element that you underline, but a lot of the story is also not related to that directly. And that's probably where you could see a lot of difference with the UK or with the US. Finished?
Yeah. If I may,
things?
Yeah. As Patrick was saying, our research was obviously focused on upper middle classes. So we didn't talk to working classes, or we didn't interpel directly to our upper middle classes about their relations to the working classes, but they emerge. The fact that they, in a way, rely on the work of unskilled workers, migrants very often emerges in the questionnaire. For example, one very clear element is when we ask them whether they have domestic workers or whether they rely on someone to provide them for their caring needs or cleaning needs. And a large majority of our informants rely on someone doing some of these tasks for them. So this is very important, not only because it facilitates the logistics of their life, but also because very often the women of the household were free by the domestic workers, often migrants, to actually join the labor market. So, these families, even if they are relatively wealthy, they also need to deal with issues of compatibilizing a professional life and a family life, and having help is fundamental for them. And obviously, as I said, here these kind of working classes supporting them and providing care and personal services for them is central, right? Another issue in which their interaction with working classes appear in the questionnaire was indirectly when we asked them, for example, in which neighborhood you would never live. And I remember very clearly in the case of Madrid that the neighborhoods that they mentioned were central areas that were both very central, inhabited by working classes, and often known to be areas where immigrants live. Okay, and there is a series of neighborhoods of Madrid that came out over and over again in the interviews as areas where they would never live. Okay, often there were areas that they didn't even know because they had this relatively distorted image by media and by perceptions of security about how these neighborhoods are, and they thought it would be unthinkable for them to live there, even if they're really not that run-down areas at all. In fact, most of the time, some of the times, these are areas that are gentrifying these days, but obviously by a very different kind of group, not by all managers. And finally, the last kind of reference I would like to make in relation to this aspect is the other question we asked them about which areas of the neighborhood, of the neighborhood in which they live in, they would avoid and why. And often we found the issue of the fear for their security, basically. And the fear for the security was clearly related to the other. Okay, and the other is both in terms of social class and in terms of ethnicity. And we asked them again, why don't you go to those areas of the neighborhood? And often they would say, there is insecurity, there is strange people, there is more crime over there, and there is more drug trafficking. And we are talking about very, very well-off areas. So these kind of areas of kind of potential danger that they perceive, you can imagine, are not particularly dangerous. But for them, in their minds, this is what the other represents, and this is clearly where they want to stay away from. And their strategies of distance and proximity we were talking about before clearly pass by avoiding those areas altogether. So in a way, they live in their particular bubbles, even if they're not segregated, but they have a very clear notion of how they need to remain in control, as we have been saying several times.
And to add the last point, this research was on the upper middle class, but the strength of our group is that Alberta has been doing a lot of work on poverty in Milan. Javier has worked on immigrants and various groups in Madrid. I have done work on poverty and immigrants in the suburbs of Paris and also on the lower middle class. So I think when we wrote about upper middle class, we had this relation element in mind, even if it's not expressed as such. And at the end of the day, we absolutely agree that there are a number of areas where those groups, we are not romanticized this upper middle class. I think we are very clear on the extent to which they don't want to mix with some other groups under some circumstances, and how they exclude and select very precisely and get rid of a number of people in their world, especially the poorest one and the ethnic ones. So this is absolutely clear. Don, next question.
I just see that Yuri joined us. Yuri.
Hey, Yuri.
But we cannot hear him,
unfortunately.
All right. There is no other questions, but we are speaking since 1 hour and 45 minutes. So this could be also a nice moment for ending our meeting. I'm very sorry that we cannot hear Yuri, which just came in. Let's try
It's always
again.
a pleasure to hear Yuri. Always a pleasure to hear Yuri. I agree.
Okay, but we cannot hear him. It's always a pleasure to see his name, at least in the chat. Okay, so I need to thank all three authors that I recall of this book, this very interesting book. Please, all of us are gonna buy this book, of course, and even more after having listening to your speech. The three authors are Alberto Andreotti, Patrick Galès, and Javier Moreno-Fuentes. And our next meeting is going to be also the last one. It's about the nature of cities, the scope and limits of urban theory. And the authors are going to be Alan Scott and Michael Storper. And thanks again to our authors, and see you in a few weeks with the participants for our last meeting for this edition of Author Meet Critics 2015.
Thank you, Giovanni, and thanks to you a lot for organizing things and with Yuri. We are very, very grateful for this talk, and thanks for the great questions. Thank you, students. Keep well. You have a great session with Storper and Scott, I can tell you too. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you,
Bye
Gianni.
bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was a great pleasure. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
And thanks, Alberta, for doing all the work.
In the back.
Goodbye.